Hello, so today we are going to be revising middle age medicine or medicine in the medieval period in Britain. Now, your Britain Health and the People course is split into four periods: the medieval or the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the industrial or the 19th century, and the modern age or the 20th century. So this is the first period, and what we will cover in today's revision session will be a quarter of your course. And hopefully it will make it feel just a little bit more manageable when you've worked your way through it. So we'll start off nice and easy. If you draw the middle of a thinking map, life in the medieval period, and we're just going to quickly go through what life was like in Britain. Hopefully a lot will start to come back to you as we're talking through it. So the medieval period or the Middle Ages on this course is loosely defined as around 1000 AD to around 1450 AD, which is the start of the Renaissance. So if you draw this in, we can just make some notes around it. So the first thing to note, which is really, really important, is the significance of the factor of religion in the Middle Ages. So religion is the most important factor, unquestionably, at this time. It affects everything from healthcare, beliefs about medicine, to just the day-to-day lives of the people at the time. So the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Britain, in fact, in Europe, in the world. They are the largest landowners, they're rich, they're powerful, they control knowledge. That includes medical knowledge. Everyone was religious and they did not question the existence of God. People believed in heaven, hell, purgatory. Remember, purgatory is a waiting room between heaven and hell where you would go to work off your sins. The more sins that you had committed, the longer you would be in purgatory. The picture is kind of a depiction of purgatory. It's a nasty place where you would be punished for your sins. If you committed terrible sins, you might go straight to hell, but the general acceptance was that most people went to purgatory, they worked off their sins, and then eventually they were able to enter the kingdom of heaven. As a result of this belief, people tried to please God every single day of their lives. And one thing they would do is they would pay money to the Catholic Church so that the monks could pray for their souls. So hopefully they would spend less time in purgatory. This is one of the reasons that the Catholic Church managed to acquire so much money and become so powerful. It really controlled the day-to-day lives of the people. People are surrounded by death and disease every single day, which meant that it was even more important to please God because they might be meeting him sooner rather than later. Now, the reason for all of this disease, hygiene is extremely poor. There is no knowledge of germs, germ theory, bacteria until 1861. So they are centuries away from finding out about germs and bacteria. Medicine is also very, very basic. Science is primitive. Medicine's made from herbs, from plants. It probably wouldn't have had much of an impact if you were seriously ill. And all of this meant that mortality rates, death rates were much, much higher, particularly in towns, which were real centres for disease. Due to this, there are several great epidemics. The one that you will study as a case study in this part of the course is the Black Death, 1348, which is the plague. And people didn't understand at all what the cause of the Black Death was. And we will loop back to this later on in the revision session. The final thing to note about public health really is that the only hospitals were in monasteries. Monasteries were Catholic buildings where the monks and the nuns lived, or the nuns lived in the nunnery, but the nuns would work there too. They provided treatment, but the treatment that they provided was a bed, food, herbal medicine, and the main treatment was prayer. Now, of course, they would be praying for a miracle. They would be praying for God to take away your illness. But generally speaking, the whole point of the prayer was that when you did die, because you were going to die, you weren't going to get better, you would spend less time in purgatory. So it's basically hospice care. It's like a hospice. It's a comfortable place to die rather than somewhere where you would get better. So now that we've done that, we're going to look at a very prevalent theory, a very important theory at the time. You could be asked a question about this specifically by itself, and that is the theory of the four humours. So what I would do if I were you is I would either make another thinking map, so the theory of the four humours in the middle, or put a subheading, the theory of the four humours, so that we can make some notes about it. So the four humours is not a theory that is made in the Middle Ages. It actually is made way before your course begins. So your course starts in 1000 AD, but this theory was made hundreds and hundreds of years before in ancient times, initially by a guy called Hippocrates, but we'll get there. So what is the theory? Just make a note of it. So the theory of the four humours is an ancient theory that states that the body is made up of four liquids. Those liquids are blood, yellow and black bile, and phlegm. When those liquids are balanced, when you have equal amounts of those liquids in your body, you would be well, you would be healthy, you would be without illness. However, if those liquids became unbalanced, you would become unwell. If you have a look at the diagram, not only are the humours associated with different seasons of the year, which makes sense. So if you look at phlegm, for example, which is the green, it's associated with the winter. That is when you would normally get chesty coughs. So that would make sense. But they're also associated with warm, dry, cold, or moist. Now, how they would diagnose you with too much blood, for example, would be if you had a fever, they would look at this wheel and they would think, okay, well, the symptom is warm. You've got a fever, you're hot, you're warm, you're moist because you're sweating. That means, according to this wheel, that you must have too much blood in your system. So that's kind of how they would diagnose. Now, this theory was initially made by this guy Hippocrates. He was an ancient Greek doctor. Although we know this theory is incorrect, the theory is not scientifically accurate, it has no scientific basis, it is important because it was the first rational theory to explain why people were sick. Before this, people just blamed it on the gods. Remember, in the Greek times, they had multiple gods, not just one. So they would blame it on different gods. And they weren't trying to think that it could be something inside the body. So it is a more rational theory, which is why Hippocrates is sometimes referred to as the father of modern medicine. Apart from coming up with the four humours, he also does some other important things. He is one of the first doctors to observe patients, watch them carefully, write down their symptoms, keep a track of how their symptoms progress so that he can use it with other patients in the future. Other doctors can use it to track patients' illness. He also recorded his findings in around 60 books called the Hippocratic Corpus. So a corpus is a collection of books. So he makes one of the first real medical textbooks. And finally, what's important is he comes up with something called the Hippocratic Oath, which is a promise to treat patients ethically. So all doctors must promise they're going to treat their patients well and only do things for the good of the patient. Doctors still actually take that today, so that has long-term significance. In fact, all of this has long-term significance because Hippocrates and his theory is believed for over 1,000 years, well over 1,000 years. And of course, today, doctors observe their patients, record their patients' symptoms. Finally, one thing that Hippocrates does is he does advocate for natural remedies. So he says, if you're unwell, take to bed, rest, try and maintain a healthy diet, a healthy lifestyle, that kind of thing. So he does advocate for healthy, natural treatments. Now, the reason his theories are believed for so long is because of another individual, Galen. So Galen is a Roman doctor in ancient Rome. He's also a surgeon, and he does a couple of things. The first thing he does that's important is he builds on the theory of the four humours. He comes up with something called the theory of opposites. It's basically when you treat the patient with whatever is the opposite of their symptoms. So if we go back to our wheel and we know that if you've got a fever, you're warm, you're moist, you might have too much blood, you should treat that patient with something cold and dry, the opposite of whatever their symptom is. Galen also advocates bloodletting, and obviously we know this is a practice that continues for years and years and years. So that's when you cut the patient to let some of the blood out, or when you apply leeches to suck the blood out, which basically is just an effort to balance the humours. Galen also works on anatomy, so he dissects animals, mostly pigs, apes, also dogs, to try and learn about the inside of the human body. He is successful in some aspects of his research, so he correctly identifies that the brain controls the body and not the heart. So the brain controls the whole nervous system, all the movements in the body. He did this in an experiment called the squealing pig. So he dissected a live pig, and by cutting behind the ear, he kind of analysed when the pig stopped screaming, and he identified that it stopped screaming when the brain, the nerves going to the brain were severed. So it proved that the brain was controlling the body. He also writes books to teach others. His books spread news about his anatomical findings, so about the squealing pig, but also about all the mistakes that he made, because of course the bodies of apes, pigs, dogs are nothing like the bodies of human beings, and he made a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of misconceptions in Galen's work, which we'll come back to in the next revision session when we look at individuals that corrected those, like Harvey and Vesalius. Now, the reason that Galen's believed for so long is because his ideas fit with the teachings of the Catholic Church. So Galen is not Catholic. I just want to get that out of the way, because a lot of students write down that Galen was Catholic. The Catholic Church was around when Galen was around. It's not. Galen is pre-Catholic. He's before the Catholic Church. He's Roman. But one thing he did that was different to people at the time was he argued that there was only one God, not multiple gods. Now, the Catholic Church obviously believe that there's one God, one creator, and they saw Galen arguing this before the Catholic Church as kind of backing up their ideas, supporting their ideas. He also argued that God made everything, including the human body, and that every organ had its place. Everything was made very specifically. The body was special. The body was sacred. Of course, that fits perfectly with the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church told people to believe Galen for over 1,000 years, which is why Galen's theories, but not only Galen's theories, also the theories of Hippocrates were believed for so long, because Galen's theory of opposites built on the theory of the four humours. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, these two individuals were really, really important. So far we have a few factors that we've tracked. We've got the factor of religion, the Catholic Church being very important. We've also got two important individuals, so Hippocrates and Galen. We also have the factor of communication, because both of these individuals pass on their information through books. So you've got the Hippocratic Corpus, and you've also got Galen's books. We don't know the titles of Galen's books. It's just the works of Galen or Galen's books. That's fine. But there's another bit to the story in terms of communication, and that's to do with Muslims, Islamic medicine, people living in the East at the time, the Middle East. So after the Romans had ruled Britain, a lot of medical knowledge was lost. This actually happened across Europe. A lot of books were lost. The period is called the Dark Ages because we don't really know much of what was happening during that time. However, during the 1200s, Europeans, including the British, the French, went on something called the Crusades. So the Crusades was a series of holy wars between the Christians in Europe, places mostly Britain and France, and the Muslims that lived in the Middle East. Now, both religions wanted control of the Holy Lands, which is Jerusalem, Bethlehem. It's important to both religions. Jesus is a prophet in Islam, and obviously Jesus is significant in Christianity as well. So both religions wanted control of this area. Now, the Muslims had worked really hard to translate ancient texts such as the Hippocratic Corpus, the works of Galen, because the Holy Quran tells them to seek out knowledge. So what they'd done when they'd conquered various lands, including lands in Greece and lands owned by the Romans, they'd taken all these books, they'd tirelessly translated them. And when the British and French crusaders, soldiers, found these texts, they brought them back to Britain. So that's how the works of Hippocrates and Galen get back to Britain. So we've got a new factor here. We've actually got the factor of war. This factor of war is linking with the factor of communication, is linking with the factor of religion because it's a religious war, and is also linking with these individuals because their ideas are being spread. Hopefully we're starting to think about the relationship between these factors, because remember, factors are very, very, very important on this paper. But why else is Islamic medicine important in Britain? Now, I know this is a bit of a tough spot for a lot of people. A lot of students forget about Islamic medicine. So if you pause the video now and draw this out, this will be a good note-making template for you. So if you split your page into 4, copy down these headings, and then resume the video when you have drawn that out, and we'll continue. Okay, so again, already you should be seeing that some of these factors are quite important. Obviously, it's Islamic medicine, so the religious element is really important. You've got these individuals, so we're going to look at 3 individuals, and you've got books, so we know that communication is crucial. So the first individual that's significant is Abul Qasis. So Abul Qasis was a Muslim surgeon. He's sometimes called the founding father of modern surgery, but this is what's important. He wrote books, and in the books he passed on his surgical techniques. He invents 26 new surgical instruments or tools that were used in surgery in the Arab world, in the East, but also, you know, it was communicated, it was brought back to Britain and France. He makes cauterization popular. Now, we know that cauterization is used in Britain for a really, really, really long time. It's still used today. Obviously, the techniques are different, but we know that through the Renaissance, cauterization is still practiced in the way that it was practiced in the Muslim East. So cauterization is when surgeons use a hot iron rod or a hot iron plate to burn a cut or an incision or a wound back together to stop the bleeding. It's very painful, but it is significant because it saves lives. You've got Razi, al-Razi. He was a Muslim doctor. He wrote over 200 books where he introduced new ideas. So his ideas are new. He challenges Hippocrates and Galen on some things. He warns people not to just blindly follow them. Make sure you're questioning them, which obviously didn't happen in Britain because people blindly followed Galen and Hippocrates for many years. In his investigation, he found that the smallpox and measles were different diseases by studying the rashes very carefully. And he did believe in observing patients before any kind of treatment. He said, believe what's in front of your eyes. Don't just read the books of Hippocrates and Galen, follow them, follow what your patient is telling you, follow what you can see from observing your patient carefully, check their pulse, check their urine, and follow that before you read up in these books. And then finally, we have Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina, that's his Arabic name, but he's also known as Avicenna in Europe. That's what the Europeans called him. So if you've got a source, he could be referred to as either, so just be aware of that. And he wrote a medical encyclopedia called the Canon, which was used by doctors until the 1600s. You can pause this if necessary to get your notes down on your page. Books. So Muslims, when they took over land, they had a vast empire, actually. They took over a lot of land. They kept the books. Again, remember the Quran encourages them to seek out knowledge. They took the books to houses of wisdom, which was kind of like a university/library. There was a huge one in Baghdad. They translated the books tirelessly into Arabic from ancient Greek and these older dead languages. The books contained the works of Galen and Hippocrates, but inside the House of Wisdom, they also had newer books too. So the works of Razi, the works of Abul Qasis, Ibn Sina. So there's new ideas that questioned Galen and Hippocrates as well. They searched for books far and wide, Africa, India, all over the world, or the world that was discovered at the time. Obviously, there's a lot of land that remained undiscovered for a while. And it's important to note that a lot of these books would have been lost if the Muslims hadn't translated them. So the factor of communication ties in with this really, really nicely. The reason that we got a lot of these medical ideas coming through to Western Europe, including Britain, is because of these Muslim scholars that translated the works of Galen, Hippocrates, newer works as well, and kept them safe. And obviously the Crusades, this holy war, is really, really important as well. So hospitals, the first hospital in Baghdad was made in 805, but there were 30 large hospitals built in Baghdad and other cities in the Arab world. They actually contain separate wards for different illnesses so that disease wouldn't spread as easily. This is not because the Muslims understood germ theory. They didn't. It's important to note that. But obviously it would have had a positive impact. They treated the poor for free, but earned huge sums of money from their wealthier patients. So the wealthy would pay for the care of the poor. This is something that is introduced in Britain, but not until like the 1700s, really, in hospitals. And by the end of the 1100s, every large town had a hospital that would provide medical care, also prayer to the sick. Now, surgery is where it gets really, really, really interesting. So the Muslims actually had really advanced types of surgery. So if you look at the bottom paragraph, I'll go there first. So they could do really small, intricate surgeries like operating on veins, removing cancerous tumors, operating on eyes to remove cataracts. They used pain relief that was fairly effective, like opium. However, there are some similarities with Christian medicine. For example, large invasive surgery was banned on religious grounds, which is the same as in Britain. We'll get to that in a moment. There's a lot of herbal medicine, animal plant extracts, chemicals such as copper sulfate, very similar to the Christian world. Prayer was recommended to heal the sick, again, really similar to the Christian world. And the way that they would find out what was wrong with the patient partially was using astrological charts. So again, a lot of similarities in terms of the superstitious element. They checked urine, pulse, lifestyle. Physicians in Britain were also doing that around the time. Something that is slightly different though, there were special inspectors to check the quality of the drugs that was used as well. So if we're thinking about very early science and technology, we do have more scientific surgery happening in the medieval East. We also have, Abulcasis technology with 26 new surgical instruments, new surgical methods. You do get some primitive technology and science kind of creeping in, but it is extremely basic, extremely basic. So I'm going to pop up an answer slide. You can check your answers against it. You can pause the video if you would like to. So here are all the answers. And then we will move on to the next part. Okay, so if you need a bit more time, feel free to pause the video, but I'm going to continue. So what we'll do now is we'll look at what people believed caused disease at the time. So if you want to, you could pop this onto a thinking map. You might want to just put a subheading, which is like causes of disease or beliefs about causes in the Middle Ages. So the first thing I want to say is that they absolutely did not understand what caused disease until germ theory was published by Louis Pasteur in 1861, which is miles away from the Middle Ages. That, by the way, is a date that I would revise, because I guarantee you can put that date somewhere on your medicine paper. There is somewhere that you can shoehorn that in, because everything either happens before germ theory or after, and it's significant to every area. It's significant to surgery, public health, treatments, beliefs about causes. So there is somewhere on the paper that you, even if it's just when you're looking at the source at the beginning, you can say whether it's before or after germ theory. So did they understand germs or not? So 1861, germ theory, Louis Pasteur, definitely some precise evidence that you can use somewhere on your paper. But let's go back to the Middle Ages. So what did people believe caused disease? The first thing they believed was that God was punishing them for their sins. So people at the time were very, very, very deeply religious. As I said before, they did not question the existence of God. The Catholic Church was really powerful, had control over the people's lives, control over medical knowledge. So they would teach people that disease was a punishment from God for their sins, for their wrongdoings. To question the church was frowned upon. You would be called a heretic, potentially, which is someone that's going against the word of God, going against the church. So people just generally accepted this as fact. They tried their best to live a really pure lifestyle. They tried their best to pray for forgiveness every day, to attend church, and to have as few sins as possible. The other thing that people believed in was they believed other like supernatural ideas, so superstitious beliefs about what was causing disease. Science is really basic. They don't have rational explanations of disease, illness. So they speculated that it could be the result of curses, witchcraft, the position of the stars or the planets. So, for example, before the Black Death, they observed that certain planets, I think it was Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, I think they were the three, were larger than normal, which they thought was a bad omen. Likewise, in the Renaissance, actually, it continues for a long time. Before the Great Plague, somebody saw a comet in the sky a week before over London and assumed that that might have been the cause of it. And medieval physicians even used patients' astrological charts to diagnose them. So if you've got a source like this, I mean, it could come up on your paper, that is a medieval physician looking into the sky, recording the stars, looking at the patient's symptoms and making a diagnosis based on an astrological chart, a birth chart of the patient. So very superstitious. Remember, one of the factors is religion and superstition. So you can talk about religion and superstition as kind of being linked together. The other prevalent theory is this theory of bad air. Later, it starts to be called miasma theory, which is the belief that poisonous air could cause disease. Miasma could be caused in this theory by rotting waste in the streets, dirty rivers, and it could cause illness if it were inhaled. To combat miasma, they would burn strong smelling herbs, they would burn fires in the streets. But yeah, so it kind of makes partial sense because towns are filthy, more people died in towns smelt bad, so you kind of see where they were going with it. And they weren't too far off, I suppose, in the sense that dirty conditions cause bad smells, but they don't understand the crucial part of it, which is the germs, the bacteria. So they're trying to address the smells by burning herbs rather than addressing the real issue, which is the germs and the bacteria. They also, of course, still believe in the theory of the four humours. So they believe that if your body has an imbalance in the four liquids or the four humours, so blood, yellow and black bile, phlegm, then you could become unwell. So moving on to public health, again, you probably just want to put a subheading, public health in the Middle Ages, or you could just do monasteries in the middle of a thinking map. So as I said previously, monasteries were places that provided healthcare. They were one of the only places that provided support and care for the sick in this period. So medieval monasteries were large Catholic buildings where the monks lived and worked, loads of land. They're very rich. They have a lot of control over the people. They were centers of local communities. So people would go in there for advice. The monks inside the monasteries would live really basic lives. Sometimes they took vows of silence, vows of poverty, vows of celibacy. And they would spend their whole day praying, serving the local community, writing manuscripts and books. So a lot of the medical texts we've got were written by hand by these monks. So the factor of communication is really important. Of course, the communication would be extremely biased. They told people only to believe in Galen. They told people to believe that God was punishing them for disease, with disease and illness, for their sins. But nevertheless, it was the only medical knowledge that they had. And the other things that they did was that they cared for the sick. So if we look here, medieval monasteries didn't offer proper medical treatment because science is basic. They don't understand the true cause of disease, but they offered hospice care. So a bed, shelter, food, herbal medicine, and prayer. As I said before, it's a comfortable place to die. Now, this is all funded by something called alms, ALMS, which is a kind of charity. So a pot would be passed around in services and people would donate what they could. This would go to the running of the hospitals. Also, rich people that wanted less time in purgatory would donate to the church, and that money would be used to help people who were sick, or really poor. Actually, poor people were also put inside these monastic hospitals. It wasn't just very sick people. There were other kinds of hospitals too. So on the outskirts of towns, there'd be hospitals for people that had leprosy. Again, they believed leprosy was a disease that was sent by God. It's when your limbs fall off as part of it. And lepers were just exiled from local communities. They were just thrown out of towns. So yeah, the Catholic Church is obviously really important. So if you get a question about the significance of the Catholic Church, obviously this is all the factor of religion. So this is all really, really important. So we'll look at surgery, and then all we need to do is the Black Death. We are almost there, and this is almost a quarter of your course, and hopefully it hasn't been too difficult. So surgery, you might want to, I mean, you'll need a full page for this alone, I imagine. So in the middle of a new page, you could write down middle-age surgery. Again, if you need to pause at any point, that's fine. So middle-age surgery in the middle of a thinking map, and let's make some notes. So in 1215, the Catholic Church banned large surgery and dissection. They did allow small surgeries, but nothing large, nothing that involves cutting into the trunk of the body, into the abdomen, nothing that involves going into the body itself. They do this because they believe that the body is sacred and it should not be cut up. It should not be tampered with. If the body is tampered with, it's hard for the soul to reach heaven. That's what they believed at the time. Small surgeries were available though, and these small surgeries you could get from two types of surgeons. So the first is a barber surgeon. That would be somebody who could carry out very small surgeries like tooth pulling, bloodletting, removal of ingrown toenails, things like that. They have no formal training at all. They do not go to university. I mean, they're not cheap, so it was often just a last resort, but they would learn by watching other barber surgeons. They would do a kind of apprenticeship, I suppose. They would also cut hair, hence the barber surgeon name. The other kind of surgeons that were around were like army surgeons, so people that were out on the battlefields performing emergency surgery on injured soldiers, things like amputations, setting broken bones. Now, I know what you're going to say, amputations are large surgeries, but this was very much like a last resort. If there's an infection that's spreading all around the body as a result of a limb that is just decaying, they would cut it off. Some had trained at universities. They would not be like universities today. So they would be taught about what Galen thought about anatomy. A lot of the information would have been incorrect. A lot of the universities had like religious backings. They were set up by the church. They would teach the theories of the church. Many army surgeons, though, just trained as apprentices. So they would watch other army surgeons. Now, I think what's really important with this, though, is, I mean, obviously it's the factor of war, right? Army surgeons, they're working on the battlefields. But what army surgeons got to see that nobody else got to see was the inside of a body. So if somebody had been stabbed and their abdomen had been cut with a sword and they were lying dead, well, the cut has already happened. So you could go and have a look and kind of see the organs in the body. There wasn't any like proper dissections happening, but they could see a bit more about how the body worked. But for the most part, they still kind of, people still followed Galen's teachings on anatomy. So surgeries that could be performed, remember kind of smaller surgeries, bloodletting, which is when you let the blood out to balance the humours, amputations in emergencies, war situations where soldiers are gravely injured, the removal of teeth. Again, that would be a barber surgeon if you're in a lot of pain. Quite expensive though, so some people likely did just put up with the pain. Removing hemorrhoids, which are lumps in the bum. Trepanning was something that was done. Now, this is not minor by any means, but this would be the drilling of a hole into the bottom of the skull to let the demons out. This was seen as a small surgery. Obviously, to us, that's quite extreme. It didn't end well. It wasn't a very successful surgery. This would be done for things like epilepsy, migraines, depression. And the tools that were used included the curved knives that were used for bloodletting, saws that would be used for amputation, tooth extraction clamps, so clamping the tooth, pulling it out, and cauterizing irons, so these plates that were used to seal wounds afterwards, hot iron plates that'd be heated up on a fire and then pushed against the wound. Extremely painful. Some people would die of shock, but it was quite effective at the time. What's important to say is none of these tools would have been clean at all, which is one of the problems with medicine at the time, or surgery at the time, because they don't have germ theory. It's filthy. They also don't have effective anesthetics. They do have opium, plant-based anesthetics, nothing that's going to put you to sleep for a long time, keep you still for a long time, nothing that's particularly safe. So surgery would have been brutal, violent, bloody, painful. Most patients would have been awake and just held down by a group of men while they were undergoing surgery. Even serious surgeries like amputation, they likely would have been awake. So there were some individuals that were significant in the medieval period that link to surgery. The first is Abulcasis. We've already mentioned him, the Muslim surgeon who invented 26 surgical instruments, popularized cauterization. You've also got John Arden. So John Arden was known as England's first surgeon. He's around in the mid-1300s. He treats the poor for free by charging the rich more. He sets up something called the Guild of Surgeons, which is a group where surgeons could share ideas. There was a lot of guilds in the medieval period for different trades. He sets up the one for surgeons. In 1350, he wrote a book called The Practice of Surgery, which shared his ideas. And he actually has a 50% survival rate, which doesn't sound good now, but it's really good at the time. It was pretty good for the time. He uses opium as a plant-based anesthetic, which was better than nothing, and urged surgeons not to rely on Hippocrates and Galen. Rely on the patient, watch the patient, rely on your own knowledge, your experience. Hugh of Lucca is an interesting one. So Hugh of Lucca believed that pus had to be scraped out from an infection in order for it to heal properly. And he would actually scrape the pus out and then use wine-soaked bandages to pack the wound. Now, it does have limited impact. It doesn't really work. But what he's doing is he's trying to think of alternatives to amputation. He doesn't want to just cut off an infected limb. He wants to try and encourage healing. But I mean, the key individual that's still really important is Galen. So Galen is still believed for two reasons. Number one, the church supports him. So everyone's just told not to question him, because if they question him, they question the church. If you question the church, you're questioning God, you're a heretic. The second thing is that dissecting humans is forbidden. So no one could actually prove him wrong. So a lot of people, a lot of surgeons actually didn't understand how the human body worked at all, because they're relying on Galen. And we know that Galen's dissections were based on animals, and therefore he made loads of mistakes. The problems that existed in surgery, firstly, blood loss. People would often bleed out, soldiers would bleed out after an amputation. Cauterization is the main treatment, really, really painful. People died of shock quite frequently. They have no idea about germs, infections, bacteria, so they couldn't take proper measures to ensure that anything was clean. Things were filthy. People had, like surgeons would perform surgery in their own clothes that they'd been walking around in. They didn't bathe, they didn't wash their hands, everything was filthy, their tools were filthy. Hugh of Lucca does experiment trying to get rid of infection with the wine-soaked bandages. It has little impact. Infection is still a massive problem. Infection is still the leading cause of death at the time after surgery. What would happen quite often is if soldiers had broken bones on the battlefield, but the bone didn't penetrate the skin, they'd be okay. But if the bone shattered and penetrated the skin, causing any kind of open wound, that's when soldiers would die. And it was literally just because of the infection that entered the wound. There was no effective pain relief, no effective anesthetic. Surgeons like John Arden used opium, alcohol. The patient would still be awake. The effects would wear off really quickly. Quite often the patient would come around while surgery was still happening. They would flail around. They weren't still. That made surgery extremely difficult. Large surgery was banned, but even if it wasn't banned, it probably wouldn't have been possible because they were not still. The patient wasn't still. And then finally, there's a key issue with knowledge. Because dissection is banned, because large surgery is banned, surgeons do not understand how the body worked. The ideas of Galen are still endorsed by the church. A lot of his findings are really, really inaccurate. There's actually a lot of similarities between surgery and public health and causes of disease and treatments between the medieval and the Renaissance. So when we do the next revision session on the Renaissance, hopefully you start to draw some similarities, because one of your questions is to look at similarities between two things from different periods. So there's lots of similarities. Just kind of make a note of that, or mental note of that. Right, okay, so let's just move on to public health, and then we are literally done. I know you've been with me for a while. I've been recording for about 40 minutes. If you're making notes, this is probably upward of an hour now, but just keep going. You're doing really, really well. So public health, this is quite a nice picture actually, demonstrating what public health might have been like at the time. So remember, public health is the health of the overall people, the health of the public. The king should have been responsible for it. The government nowadays are responsible for it, but we know the factor of government isn't really one that's as important in this period. The government take very little responsibility. The king does count as the government, by the way, in these early years, but they're not taking much responsibility at all. Local councils aren't taking much responsibility. As a consequence, what you can see is overcrowded streets, overcrowded housing. You can see a river. All towns were built on the banks of a river. The river was used to source drinking water, to bathe in, but also there would be sewers, open sewers. You can actually see them in the picture, those two brown gutters that run down the road. That's an open sewer. So people's excrement, poo and wee, would literally run in little streams down the street. It would overflow, of course. You'd be walking in this kind of filth, and it would flow into the river, the same river that people are fishing in, the same river that people are sourcing drinking water from sometimes. There would be a well, but the well couldn't cope with the demand of people that were moving into towns. There is kind of a boom, and people are moving, more and more people are moving into towns for freedom, for more rights, because if they lived and worked in the countryside, they had to live and work on the land of their lord under the feudal system. They couldn't leave. They had no rights. If you could get into a town for a year and a day, you would be declared a free man, and you would have more rights and freedoms. There was also a lot of trade happening in towns that wasn't happening in the countries. There'd be a market, lots of goods moving through along the river. So people had more economic opportunities as well. But yeah, towns are absolutely filthy, absolutely disgusting. There was literal latrines over the river. So that's what you can see on the bridge. There's a little hut. It's a toilet. So you literally just go to the toilet. There'd be a hole and it would go into the river, like absolutely filthy. You can actually see in the picture, if you look closely, a butcher that's butchering meats just out in the streets. There was no regulations on things like that. So you'd have entrails, bits of rotting meat. Of course, there's horses, there's pigs, there's chickens, just everywhere. Those animals cause waste as well, don't they? So you'd have horse poo, pig poo all over the streets. Try and use animal waste and human waste, though, if you're writing it down. The examiner will know what you mean. Please don't write poo. But yeah, really crowded, really dirty conditions. There is somewhere that's quite different. And I think if you're asked a question about medieval public health, the examiner will be quite impressed if you remember this. It's Coventry. So Coventry is a little bit better. And if we're looking for the factor of government at the time, the local council or the local government in Coventry do something really, really different to other local councils in England. They order that on Saturday, every person in the town of Coventry must clean outside their house, or they would be fined for not doing that. They also collect a penny from every house and shop every 3 months to pay for waste removal, so rubbish to be taken out of the town and taken to a dunghill, which is kind of like a tip on the outskirts of the town. So it's important that it's on the outskirts of the town, not in the middle of the town. You were not allowed to dump waste in the river, and they also removed the latrines or the toilets from the river to allow the water to flow more freely, to stop the sewage from overflowing into the town. So they are doing something different. They are trying to make things better in Coventry. Of course, they're doing all of this because they believe that these dirty conditions are causing miasma or bad air, not because they understand germs. But obviously, it would have had an impact on the health of the people, on public health in Coventry. The other place that public health is a lot better is in the monasteries. So if you have a look at this monastery, they have a toilet block or latrines that are separate from the main building. That's also separate from the kitchen. They have their own well, their own water supply that didn't come from the river. So monks didn't get as sick as people in the towns. They would have said it's because they're pure, because they're not committing sins, because they're not being punished from God, perhaps because they're away from the miasma or the bad air in the towns. In fact, we know logically that it's because they weren't interacting with the same bacteria that people in towns were. But remember, they do not understand that at the time. So the case study for this course for the medieval period is the Black Death. So let's have a look at that. It's literally the last thing we're going to do. The Black Death is an example of public health. So the Black Death is an outbreak of bubonic plague that came to Europe via trade routes from China, arrives in London in 1348, spreads around England throughout 1349 and into 1350. And at the time, people have no idea what's causing it. So at the time, they thought that it was due to a punishment from God, the position of the planets, bad or poisonous air, an imbalance of the four humours, and they also blamed Jews for poisoning the wells. It's likely that they didn't actually believe that the Jews were poisoning the wells. It's just an example of anti-Semitism. It's just an example of them trying to get rid of the Jews because A, they believed they were a threat to Christianity, but B, because the Jews worked as moneylenders. They'd gotten some of them had gotten extremely rich. It was jealousy. It was an excuse for them to dissolve their debts. If they owed Jewish people money, if they got rid of the Jews, blaming them for something like this so that they would be killed, they would never have to pay them back. So the real cause is the black rat, which is native to China, carrying the black bacteria Yersinia pestis, which is the plague bacteria. The rats travelled on ships along trade routes throughout Europe. Fleas, so tiny insects, would live in the rat's fur, suck the blood of the rats, become carriers of the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Then they would jump onto a human host, bite the human, infect the human. So that's how it was really spreading. It's bacteria, it's germs. They don't know that at the time because they don't have germ theory until 1861. See how you can use that date all the time. There are three kinds of plagues that develop. The first is bubonic. That one, you get painful buboes or swellings under your arms, these pus-filled lumps. About a 50% chance of death if you lanced your buboes or popped them, got the pus out. However, the plague could spread to your lungs. That's pneumonic plague. Then you could breathe the plague onto other people, so it could be spread by breath. You would get chest pains, you'd get coughing up blood. That's 90% chance of death. And then if the plague spread to your bloodstream, it becomes septicemic, which is just 100% chance of death. Symptoms of bubonic plague, as I said, painful swellings, buboes under the arms and groin. The victim would then vomit, get a terrible fever, which is like high temperature, bleeding under the skin, which would cause bruises, black purple spots, which is why it's called the Black Death, is because your skin turns a very, very dark colour due to this bleeding, due to this bruising. The disease would then attack the nerves, making you spasm or twitch violently, extremely painful. And then finally, if the buboes popped, or if you popped them, you might have had a small chance of survival, but generally speaking, most people died within kind of a week. Absolutely terrifying illness. People at the time believed, as I said, that it was caused by God. People believed it was physically the end of the world. They thought it was the apocalypse. Terrifying, and no effective treatment. So things that they did, some people turned to religion, of course. So the king, the bishops sent out orders for churchmen to lead processions or services through the streets, pleading with God to end the Black Death. The government ordered people to clean outside their houses to get rid of the bad air. So that's something that they were doing. If they didn't, they were fined. So that shows the government taking a little bit of ownership, but of course not much compared to what we see in the modern age. And then other treatments, again, very superstitious, would have had little impact. You've got consuming or wearing cooked onions, eating 10-year-old treacle, which is a thick, sugary substance, Arsenic, so they would carry arsenic with them. That is poisonous, so it probably did more harm than good, but they didn't know that at the time. If you were rich enough, you could carry crushed emeralds with you. Sitting in the sewers, I'm not really sure what that was supposed to do. Fumigating your house with herbs, so burning herbs and letting the smoke waft around your house to get rid of the bad air. Sitting in a room between two enormous fires, lancing the buboes or popping the buboes. Finally, something that's really important, the flagellants. There were people called flagellants who would whip themselves to show God they were really sorry. They would march from town to town with these whips, just self-flagellating or whipping themselves. So that shows that religion was really important. It showed that people thought that God was punishing them and they needed to punish themselves to take that away. So the aftermath, the long-term significance of the Black Death. So many people died. I mean, the Black Death, in fact, kills about 20 million people in Europe, 2 million in Britain. Those that were left would have had deep trauma. Most people lost family members, lost friends. A lot of people that were killed were actually the peasants. So a third of the peasants in total died, which meant there were fewer people working in the fields, which led to crops just rotting. There was no one to pick them. The crops certainly wouldn't have made it into the towns, which led to extreme food shortages. And the peasants that were left behind were having to work harder. They also realized their value because they thought, hang on, we're at the bottom of society, we're at the bottom of the feudal systems, that triangle of power that they had at the time. The peasants were right at the bottom, they weren't valued. But as soon as the peasants started to die and people started to starve, they thought, actually, our job is really important because without us, you don't eat. And now you want me to do the job of 3 peasants. Well, if you want me to do that, you have to pay me more. So the peasants start demanding more freedom. They start demanding more rights. They start demanding higher wages. And the following year, in 1351, the king actually passes a law called the Statute of Labourers, which meant that they couldn't ask for more money. He actually also raises taxes. So the peasants are paying the same taxes as the rich. It's called a poll tax, and it's not fair because obviously the peasants don't earn as much money. A lot of the peasants were serfs, which meant they weren't allowed to leave the land of their lord. And over the next 30 years, the peasants just get angrier and angrier and angrier. And in 1381, they've had enough. Something happens called the Peasants' Revolt, which is when the peasants march to London and they demand 2 things. They demand the ability to move around and ask for higher wages, their freedom. And they demand higher wages and the ability to just make decisions about their own lives. So they couldn't make decisions, for example, about who to marry, where to live, because their lord made all the decisions for them. Now, the Peasants' Revolt actually fails. The leaders are killed. But slowly over time, this feudal system, this pyramid of power does start to crumble, does start to break away, and we do see real social change. So one thing you could be asked is explain 2 similarities between the Black Death of 1348 and cholera of the 1800s. And what you could argue is that they both lead to a certain amount of social change. So obviously what I've just described about the Peasants' Revolt is important to the Black Death, but in cholera you get social change in the sense that you get public health reform, you get the redesign of the sewers. So obviously this doesn't seem that important to medicine, but if I'm explaining it, it's probably because I've got a question in mind that you could be asked that I just want to make sure you're prepared for. But that's all you really need to know about it. So don't go and do your additional research about the Peasants' Revolt, because you'll go off into, you'll get distracted and you'll end up revising too much. And this is basically all you need. So there is meaningful change over time that would have improved the lives of peasants living in England. So that is the Middle Ages. I've been talking for nearly an hour. What I would advise you do with this revision is go back through it, think about what's significant, what changes over the period, does anything change over the period, what stays the same. Also thinking about these factors. So remember, you've got 7 factors, you've got individuals, we've had a few individuals now, so revise the individuals. You've got communication, so books, how ideas are spread, war, war in the period, it would be the army surgeons is evidence of war, but also the Crusades, government, science and technology, religion. Religion is really, really big, and then luck and chance. So there are some that you won't find. So luck and chance you won't find much of. Science and technology you won't find much of. Government, it's there, but not really as significant. Religion, there's a lot of. So just think about which factors are significant in the Middle Ages that aren't significant later on. Which factors are significant later on that aren't very significant in the medieval? How does that change over time? And then which factors are consistent throughout all the periods, because that will really help you with your factors question. So the ones that are significant all the way through, you get individuals all the way through, you get communication all the way through, you get war all the way through. The others kind of change as time goes on, becoming more important or less important. So I hope that's been helpful, and I will see you next time for the Renaissance revision session.